I think you look at a lot and you come to your own conclusions. I've never found that reading about anything has helped me at all. That really my information has come from my own observations of things. And maybe afterwards I will read about it because I found something puzzling or interesting which I couldn't understand. I'd like to explore it further. But even doing that, for instance, the thing that has always mystified me in the Middle Eastern architecture is the very florid, rich use of pattern on the floors, on the walls. And to me, I've never been able to understand this. I mean, first of all, it's I guess so different from the Oriental tradition, which is one of great simplicity, and suddenly to move to one where you have this terribly, terribly rich pattern. I'm only beginning to understand it now. And I've done a lot of reading, but none of the reading tells you what you really want to know. None of it.
Arthur Erickson once said, "Everything I do, everything I see is through architecture. It has given me a vehicle for looking at the world." On the other hand, you might say that it's given the world a vehicle for looking at Arthur Erickson. And the world has not only looked, but given him recognition. He is, in fact, Canada's most honoured architect, and has won the most prestigious awards open to Canadians. Awards from the Canada Council and the Royal Bank of Canada for outstanding contributions to human welfare and the common good. He was named an Officer of the Order of Canada, and recently the top honour, Companion of the Order of Canada. Arthur has probably forgotten how many awards he's received. There must be over 50, nationally and internationally. His face has been on the cover of Time magazine. He's been the subject of a New Yorker profile. He's been written about in the Illustrated London News. The list goes on and on. He has projects around the world: Kuwait, Iraq, England, United States. He's designed universities in Saudi Arabia, Lethbridge, Vancouver. His design of the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 70 won the award for Best Pavilion from the Architectural Institute of Japan.
When I first came to Japan in '61, I was really not prepared for what I was going to see. And many of the temples that I expected from photographs and everything else to be extremely powerful and very subtle and represent many of the things I was striving for in architecture at the time was very different. In fact, I was a little bit dismayed by the fact that they were built of wood, that they're very temporary, that they had none of the monumentality that I was used to in Western architecture. And for 2 months, I was really in a dilemma because I knew these were great works of art, but somehow or other they didn't speak to me. And then one day I vowed that a certain tea house in the moss garden of the Cocadera, which was very famous and supposed to be very beautiful, but one which I simply couldn't understand, I vowed that I would visit that tea house and I would stay in the garden until I really understood it, until it spoke to me. So I went to the garden and I spent 2, 3 hours, 4 hours, and I was getting very hungry. And I thought, well, now, how am I going to keep my vow and yet not starve? And just as I was sitting in a shelter looking across the lake, I heard a rustle in the forest, and at first I thought they were birds or maybe monkeys or something coming through the forest. But instead, there emerged a group of women gardeners who were pruning the trees. And instead of having the kind of implements that we would have to prune trees, They had very, very small scissors, not much larger than what we would consider nail scissors. And instead of sawing branches as we would do, they were clipping each leaf from the maples, and they were taking each cluster of pine needles and taking out the dead needles and trimming each cluster. And I thought, well, how absurd to be worried about a leaf or a needle when you have so many of them. And then I noticed that the area that they had been through suddenly breathed with an extraordinary airiness, and all of the plants seemed to come alive because they were given enough space and enough room and enough air to grow. And to me this was miraculous, because the forest, the whole garden, which looked like an untouched natural garden, looked so much better and still untouched and natural after they'd been through. So I began to think, for someone to be able to do that, there must be an understanding and appreciation of nature and natural forms that we in the West could never understand. That we in the West had always been influenced by the human form, and that we based our sense of proportion, our sense of form, even the characteristics of vitality on the human form. And then I began to realize that what they were trying to achieve was something that had to do with the natural rhythm of growth in their buildings. They were not concerned with physical vitality as we are. They were concerned with the grace and the proportion and the aspects of growth, from the infinitesimal root hairs through the roots, the trunk, to the branches, to the leaves, going from a kind of infinity to infinity, and that the lines that they used, the way they arranged their compositions, was very much determined by this idea of growth. And from then on, a whole new perception of architecture was open to me.
Arthur Erickson's first architectural inspirations came from the great American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright. He enrolled at McGill, where he eventually got his degree. Of course, his roots are West Coast. He was born in Vancouver. His interests in art and design were probably inherited from his mother and father, who were both amateur painters. And when he was only 16 years old, he was encouraged by Lauren Harris to exhibit at the Vancouver Art Gallery, where he won 2 honorable mentions. His interest in Oriental art and philosophy may have taken root when he was sent to a Japanese language school and was posted to Calcutta and Kuala Lumpur. After graduation from university and a period of world travel, Arthur settled again in Vancouver, working and teaching. It's interesting to note that he designed then, and still lives in, a house that reflects those early interests in the beauty of the Orient.
My house is really not a house, it's a hovel. And my needs for shelter were very simple. I only needed one space in which to live and work, but I wanted a very pleasant garden, and I wanted to bring the garden into the house through the use of mirrors and reflection. And the house basically is a one-room house that was originally a one-car garage, and onto it I added another garage, which happened to be here at the time I got the house. So I'm very happy to say to friends in the East and splendid houses that I live in a garage. And that's basically all it has been. It doesn't have extra rooms, doesn't have a bedroom. I climb up into a loft to go to bed, and it's perfect for my needs when I come to Vancouver. In 1958, I designed the Filbert House in Vancouver Island. And that was a very early house. I was just beginning to build, and I was fascinated by materials. And I think it's too complicated in its use of materials. But I think the main thing, which the house did recognize, was the beauty of the site, which I think is one of the most beautiful sites anywhere in the world. And the house really recognizes its sort of majestic setting on top of a cliff and overlooking the whole of the Straits of Georgia. When we were given the cliff edge site for the Museum of Anthropology, because we had to show the native houses and the native massive carvings outside as well as inside, that there was an opportunity to show those pieces in the kind of setting that you would find them in the north. And to me, this is absolutely essential. You know, site, location, the interpretation of site, which is at the bottom of all architecture, is absolutely essential. And to take the house frame or the massive carving and show it in a foreign circumstance, I think you're missing a great opportunity. And that's the way we've seen these pieces most of the time. So there's an opportunity here to show them the way they originally were set, and that is between the forest and the sea, so that this humanizing was done on these trees that came to the edge of the sea. The introduction to that through the museum itself was very logical, because one started at the top and you came down to this lake edge, and as you came down you learned more and more and more about the various cultures of the West Coast, and you'd see them in contrast, which was important, because if you just jumble these pieces together, you never realize the enormous stylistic differences which made them as different as the art of Italy and the art of Germany in the Middle Ages. I've always felt that in placing something on the site, first of all, you want to incorporate the site in the building and vice versa. And therefore, the center of the house is the place where everything comes together, and then gradually it should disintegrate into the surroundings. And by doing that, the surroundings take over, not abruptly at the edge of the house, but very slowly. And I've always tried to disguise the point where one ends and the other begins by continuing out certain parts of the house, like the structure or the wall of glass or the floor, and then you reflect it in terraces or something out in the landscape, so that you have the maximum extension of the building into the landscape.
And we can plan it so that the elevating would work for the final stage, and but you can have the atrium space enclosed.
We always work with three-dimensional models simply because drawings do not give you a sufficient picture of everything that's happening on a project. And we use it for our own study as a project develops, and we start with very, very small models and then move to larger and larger and larger models, often models of full-scale details of a project. But it's also the most useful way of carrying on a dialogue with a client, because drawings are very hard to read, and perspectives really don't tell you what something is like. But models, I think, everybody understands. And it also becomes a very different and quite unique statement in the city. It almost says, look, this is the top of the city.
Yeah.
No matter what anybody else does. Canada and Japan are very true to their traditions, and Canada, as with all of America and South America, we've always destroyed things. We came in, we destroyed the forest to make the homestead, we destroyed the homesteads to make the city. And that's been our pattern, it's our tradition. The fact that many people don't even know their forefathers or are not the least bit interested. So we have no compunctions about getting rid of the past. Whereas in Japan, there is no past. Everything is present. All of the past is alive, and one can partake of it at any time. I think certainly the greatest art in Japan is their art of the garden. And here you find in a very confined space, a space that's no wider than really 6 feet wide and about 40 feet long, but by that time you're in the midst of a jungle. A very simple arrangement of a few plants, ferns, bamboo, and azalea, and rocks used in special ways to give a tremendous richness of texture and form, and an extension of your vista, so that sitting on the edge of a garden of this kind, you can imagine that it goes on endlessly, that you are on the edge of a forest. Some people would say that this garden of mine is influenced by the Japanese, but it may be in some respects, but basically it's very un-Japanese. It's absolutely wild, unmanicured, untamed, but gives an atmosphere of naturalness, which is why they think that it seems to resemble the Japanese. But one of the things that probably is important and gives it that sense is the use of water. And I found that you need to bring the bright surface of water onto the ground, because the water always reflects the sky, and in dull days, in the very flat light of this climate, that white light is picked up in the water and gives some kind of sparkle to the ground plane. This seems to be very important in our climate, and one thing that I incorporate all the time. At Robson Square, there were several things. First of all, our concern was very much to provide a place of identity in the city, which Vancouver had lacked. Vancouver for years had been trying to have a city square, something which was identifiable as sort of the central place in the city. And because it was a 3-block complex, and because there were 3 major uses to be placed on it, which were 3 very important aspects of our culture. One is the arts, which I would place first because it would be my prejudice. Secondly is law, and third is government. The arts, simply because in Vancouver in particular, in Canada as a whole, and even in North America, the arts are very suspect, is going into an old courthouse, which will give it at least respectability. Government, we were putting underground because we felt that the least seen of government, the better. And also putting a park on top, so that really the gesture that government was making to the public was creating a public space. The courts, through long investigation and discussion with the users, the judges and the lawyers involved, we felt we hadn't opened up so that really law became part of the public domain in a real architectural sense. And really we can do very little in our buildings, but we can offer opportunities. The opportunity may not be taken, but it seemed that it was important that the courthouse, instead of being a place where one entered with great apprehension, should be a place that one entered with enthusiasm, because it was much more than a courthouse. in the largest sense, the people, but not in the small sense, are the first consideration in public buildings. The demands of the individual have to be met. But I think much more important than that is what is it doing in a cultural sense in the city? What is it doing for the city at large and not just for the individuals that are involved in that building? I think something that comes very much from strong, clear light. Well, I think today we live in a world community. I think there's no question about that. I think it's everyone's duty to find out as much about the rest of the world as possible and to really understand and appreciate other people, other ways of thinking, and not to impose their own ways of thinking onto others. I think, in a way, my office reflects this because we try to bring in as many architects from different parts of the world as possible. At one time, we had, I think, 30 or 40 different languages represented in our office. And I believe when I had a staff of about 75, there were only 10 Canadians. And I really felt this was important to the Canadians because I think Canada is simply cut off from the rest of the world, and Canadians are very dumb about the rest of the world. And I felt it was absolutely essential that they be exposed to completely different attitudes. And I think the experiment worked very well. It was a very exciting office, and there was a lot of tension, which I think is very good. There was a lot of argument, which I think is very good. And I think everybody learned, and I think that's the only atmosphere in which you can create good work, and that is when you are in a learning situation. The siting of Lethbridge and the whole form of the university is very, very different from Simon Fraser. Simon Fraser, you must remember, was on a mountaintop, and therefore the whole idea of terracing, of not only terracing the building, but the playing fields, the parking lots, and everything else, so that it sat and built itself into the mountain was very important. And because it was a milder climate, the openness, the outside spaces became very important. In Lethbridge, it was the opposite, that the climate is hostile enough, particularly during the university year, that it needed to be closed as much as possible. And the thing that I noticed when we started to look at the site at the very beginning, how on the prairie, the slightest thing is important. You know, a telephone pole, a fence post. All of these things read very, very strongly, and that's why the grain elevators are so effective, because they're powerful structures in the prairie. A cluster of trees is a powerful structure. So I didn't want to have a building which sat up on that flat table. I wanted again to have a building which worked with the landscape. The building could start as a very strong, relentless horizontal that just stretched from one side to the other and then begin to fall away underneath and accommodate itself to the different contours down below. So the university became almost like an enormous ship, closed ship, that is floating in the waves of the coulees. Certainly in my field, and I think in most other fields, one has to allow information to come from many sources, and not to consciously take in information. If you allow yourself to be open to information, I believe you take it in unconsciously. One of the things that one has to be able to accept and deal with is the idea of complete contradictions. If you're thinking consciously, you can't really allow contradictions. You try to rationalize out the contradictions. But I believe that that existence is full of contradictions, that everything is full of contradictions, and contradictions are at the very essence of human life. And therefore, it's essential that that one is able to accept whatever information comes. One is able to accept whatever difference of opinions, difference of attitudes, another culture, and other people may have. And I find this personally very stimulating to travel somewhere where the values are entirely different than mine. I think the mistake that many people make about a drab climate as ours, a gray climate, is that in order to react to it, you bring bright color in. But it's actually the opposite. You have to be very subtle in your use of colors, and therefore we have to learn, I've always said we have to learn in, for instance, the Vancouver climate, to see the beauty of the grays, to see the softness of the and the subtleties of the gray day, and until we develop an architecture which complements that and looks best in the gray circumstance than in the bright sunlight, we can't develop any contentment with our environment.